Все, можно начинать. Спасибо большое, что меня ждали.
Спасибо. Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues,
добрый день.
good afternoon. Let me welcome you
Продолжить заседание
and let us continue this session of the Dissertation Council for the Defense of Thesis by Yidan after the technical break.
в соответствии с приказом
According to the order of St. Petersburg University, dated the 23rd of March 2020, number 2304/1,
наше заседание
our meeting is being held in the remote access mode, which includes my colleagues, members of the Council, and the applicant.
Стружицкая Ольга
Struzhitska Olga
Юрьевна,
Yuryvna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Associate Professor, Professor of the Department of Development and Differential Psychology of St. Petersburg University. Can you see and hear us? The answer is positive. Miklayeva Anastasia Vladimirovna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Associate Professor, Department of Human Psychology, Erzin, Russian State Pedagogical University. Can you see and hear us? Yes, colleagues, I can see and hear you all. Shukina Maria Alexeyevna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor, Head of the Department of General Age and Differential Psychology at St. Petersburg State Institute of Psychology and Social Work. Can you see and hear us? Yes, colleagues, I can see and hear all of you very well. Thank you. Dariusz Krok, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, University of Opol, Poland. Can you see? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
And the degree applicant Sue Yidan. Can you see and hear us? Yes. Also, the academic advisor of the degree applicant, Danilenko Olga Ivanovna, Doctor of Cultural Studies, Associate Professor, Professor of General Psychology Department of St. Petersburg University, is present. Can you see and hear us? We can't hear you. Yes, I can see and hear you. Thank you. So, all the members of the Dissertation Council, as well as the degree applicant, are present, and we can all see and hear each other. Dear colleagues, since our meeting is being held in the remote access mode, according to St. Petersburg University Order, the 23rd of March 2020, number 2304/1, I invite all the participants to follow the procedure closely. In case of a technical failure and you stop seeing or hearing someone, please let me know. I will call a technical break until such issues are eliminated. If the connection with me is lost, the announcement shall be made by Struzhitskaya Olga Yuryvna. Olga Yuryvna, do you mind? Yes, I agree. Dear Council members, do you agree
Yes.
with this arrangement? Yes, we do. Let's continue. Let me also inform you that our meeting is being recorded and broadcast online at the St. Petersburg University website, and the speeches are being simultaneously translated from Russian into English and from English into Russian. The applicant's page currently displays an email address to which anyone can send anyone present at the Dissertation Council session can send their opinion or questions to the applicant online regarding her thesis and the ongoing scientific discussion of her presentation. These questions shall be forwarded to me by our technical officers, and I shall read them out during the discussion part. Questions should be related strictly to the applicant's speech and the content of her thesis, and all messages must include name, position, place of work of the author of the question. Questions that are not related to the scientific discussion or to the discussion or the text of the thesis shall not be presented. In accordance with the internal regulations of St. Petersburg University, a session of the Dissertation Council is duly constituted if at least 2/3 of the approved members of the Council are participating, but not less than 4 persons. Our Council consists of 5 members. 5 members are present, all in the remote interactive mode. Audio-visual contact has been established with all of them. Thus, we have the quorum. I instruct curator of our session, Sazonova Ekaterina Vyacheslavorovna, officer of the Dissertation Council Activity Support Department, to draw up the attendance list in which the Dissertation Council members present and the degree applicant shall be recorded, and to indicate their work mode, in this case remote. Let me set forth the procedure of today's session with the approximate duration of approximately 2 hours. First, the chairman's summary report on the main content of documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the applicable regulations, answers to possible questions, approximately 5 minutes. Second, a brief presentation by the degree applicant outlining the key points of her study, approximately 15 minutes. Third, questions to the applicant strictly on her report, no more than 2 minutes per each question. 4, answers of the applicant, maximum 5 minutes for all questions. 5, speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews, with their opinion of the thesis and statement of their opinions, questions, and suggestions to the degree applicant. No more than 10 minutes for each speaker. 6, speech of the chairman and her review, approximately 10 minutes. 7, answers of the applicant to questions and comments made by the members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 15 minutes. We don't need a technical break. Thank you. 9, final answers of the applicant to questions asked, no more than 5 minutes. 10, presentation by the chairman of questions sent to the applicant in the course of the scientific discussion, broadcasting the meeting of the Dissertation Council at the university website. 11, answers of the applicant, if any such questions are sent. Speech of the academic advisor of the applicant, no more than 3 minutes. 13, a discussion of the Dissertation Council members before the open voting of the defense results for the period, the time of this sound on the broadcast recording shall be switched off. 14, open individual voting. The voices shall be counted and the results shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. 15, a decision on awarding or not awarding St. Petersburg University academic degree to the degree applicant. 16, closing remarks of the degree applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions or objections to this procedure? If no one has any objections, let's start running the procedure, but please remember to switch off your mobile phones. Thank you for your understanding. So, I shall now begin the meeting. The floor is given to the academic advisor of Yidan, Doctor of Cultural Studies, Associate Professor of General Psychology Department of St. Petersburg University, Danilenko Olga Ivanovna. Please introduce the degree applicants to us. Dear colleagues, dear members of the Dissertation Council, I would like to present to you Doctoral student Yidan, who has worked on her thesis at St. Petersburg University, and it was on the topic psychological predictors of subjective well-being on the example of Chinese students. Yidan conducted rigorous work, the result of which today is presented for your discussion. Olga Ivanovna, thank you for introducing Sue Yidan. You will have the floor again after the presentation of the degree applicant and after this, council members make their speeches. The thesis by Sue Yidan for the degree of candidate of psychological sciences, scientific specialization 190001, general psychology, personality psychology, and history of psychology, on the theme psychological predictors of subjective well-being on the example of Chinese students, was accepted for defense by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg University. Let's announce a technical break. Video connection to Professor Krok was lost. Professor Krok, can you?
Hello, I have lost you. Hello.
Thank you. Let us continue.
Hello. Okay.
This is by Sue Yidan, was accepted for defense by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg University, dated the 17th of February 2020, number 1033/1. Sue Yidan wrote her thesis on the basis of St. Petersburg University. The academic advisor of Sue Yidan is Doctor of Cultural Studies, Associate Professor, Professor of General Psychology, Department of St. Petersburg University, Danilenko Olga Ivanovna. The number of publications of the degree applicant, which set out the main scientific results of her thesis, according to the enclosed list, is 6, including publications in peer-reviewed scientific databases, various science and Scopus, 1 publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, 3. The applicant submitted to the academic secretary a full package of documents for the thesis to be accepted for consideration and defense. All the documents comply with Article 12, Section 3 of the order. All the documents submitted by the applicant, according to the information I received from the curator, comply with the requirements and are kept in the applicant's attestation file. Copies are available from the officer of the Dissertation Council Support Department, the curator of today's session, Sazonova Ekaterina Vyacheslavna, who's currently in touch with us. Anyone has questions? No, thank you. Now let's give the floor to Sue Yidan for her presentation. Let me remind the presentation should take not more than 15 minutes. Can start the presentation. Dear council members, can you see the slides? Dear Chairman, I can start, right? Dear Chairman and members of the Dissertation Council, let me introduce to you a brief report on my thesis, psychological predictors of subjective well-being. Academic advisor, Doctor of Cultural Studies, Professor of General Psychology, Olga Ivanovna Danilenko. Let's call it No, it's okay. Please continue. Subjective well-being affects all manifestations of human health, productivity, relationships with others. This stimulates psychological research, factors of subjective well-being, including the state of individual's value and meaning sphere. Russian science has developed a value-oriented approach to assessing dissociation of significance and accessibility of values. However, the possible negative consequences of such dissociation have not been sufficiently studied. The role of personal characteristics contributing to overcome unfavorable external conditions and successful as components also joint ventures is related with the related to the experience and not being able to realize meaningful value. Since there are many students from China in Russia, the results of this study can be useful in providing psychological help to those who's having trouble adapting. Another significant argument for relevance of this study is a sample of Chinese students need to learn to adapt to the need of the approaches developed in Russian science for actively developing Chinese scientific and practical psychology. The purpose of our study was to identify the relative contribution of components of personal potential and the imbalance in the importance and accessibility of personal values to subjective well-being of Chinese students. So totally we had 5 tasks shown in this slide. General hypothesis that psychological characteristics of personality as components of personal potential make a positive contribution to subjective well-being of Chinese students, while imbalance of personal values in importance and accessibility makes a negative contribution. Private hypotheses, we had 4 specific hypotheses, also shown in this slide. Yeah, please go ahead. In the course of my study, a comprehensive diagnostic program was developed and used, also shown in this slide. Thank you. I think everybody can see. We have all read your thesis. Methods of mathematical statistics for data processing are shown in the next slide. Thank you. The sample characteristics. The study enrolled 722 students in Beijing, Tianjin, Nanjing, and Shanghai, of whom 200 were boys and 522 were girls. Age range was 18 to 25. To adapt the methodology and accessibility in various life spheres. We used data from 99 students studying the same universities they used. So the sample included 43 women and 56 men, 18 to 25 years old. Next, let's proceed to the results of the study. In order to integrate indicators of methods for measuring the emotional and cognitive components of subjective well-being and to identify groups with different levels of subjective well-being, we applied method of clustering means. The pie chart shows the number of people included in the high, medium, and low subjective well-being groups. This histogram shows the indicators of these groups by well-being index and life satisfaction index. To test the first specific hypothesis, we compared indicators of the components of personal potential and the indicators of imbalance of personal values in terms of significance and accessibility among students with different levels of subjective well-being. The results of this comparison are shown in tables 1 and 2. As you can see from table 1, practically all the students studied personal characteristics. Average values of indicators differ in groups with low, medium, and high levels of subjective well-being. Differences in all the studied characteristics are significant at the level B less than only difference in indicators of dispositional optimism are less expressive, although they are at the level of significance P less than 0.05. The data in table 2 showed that the average value of value imbalance indicators this gradual increase from the group with higher level of subjective well-being to the group with lower level of subjective well-being. And the neutral zone indicator showed the opposite trend. These histograms show this data graphically. Persons with higher levels of subjective well-being have higher rates of self-efficacy and dispositional optimism than persons with lower levels of subjective well-being. Next, in the histogram to the left, you may see that students with high levels of subjective well-being have the highest values for problem-oriented coping and the lowest average values for emotional-oriented coping strategies. The figure to the right shows that those with higher level of subjective well-being have higher values for the resilience component. Individuals with higher levels of subjective well-being have lower scores on value imbalance indicators. Thus, our first hypothesis that Chinese students with a higher level of subjective well-being have higher scores on the components of personal potential and lower scores on the imbalance of personal values and importance and accessibility is confirmed. To test the second specific hypothesis that positive predictors of subjective well-being are components of personal potential, and negative predictors, indicators of imbalance of personal values. Regression analysis was conducted. The results are shown in Table 3. We found that there are 8 variables that contribute to the emotional component of subjective well-being, and 6 variables contribute to the cognitive component of subjective well-being. All variables that contribute to the cognitive component also contribute to the emotional component of subjective well-being. The emotional component, specific predictors, disposition of emotional optimism, and preferred use of the coping strategy are problematic. Based on the results of both models, we can say that the positive predictors of subjective well-being of the students from our samples are the components of the personal potential: self-efficacy, engagement, dispositional optimism, problem-oriented coping strategies, problem-solving planning, and recourse to help. The strongest predictor is self-efficacy. Negative predictors are internal conflict as a manifestation of imbalance of personal values and a preference for emotionally oriented coping strategies, self-penalization and rationalization. Thus, our second hypothesis as a whole also was confirmed. To test the third hypothesis about both general and specific predictors of subjective well-being in men and women, we compared the results of regression analysis of data in these samples. They are presented in tables 4 and 5. So this is table 4, and this is table 5. Considering the results of regression analysis of emotional and cognitive components of subjective well-being together, we can draw the following conclusions. The common positive predictors for both samples are self-efficacy, engagement, and planning for solving problems. Common negative predictors are self-penalizing. For women, specific position predictors are aid-seeking, and dispositional optimism. Negative predictors are rationalization and self-penalizing. For both men and women, a negative predictor is an indicator of the imbalance of personal values. But there is a significant difference for women. Such predictor means internal conflict. In men, internal vacuum. Thus, the third specific hypothesis has been confirmed. Next, the fourth hypothesis that indicators of components of personal potential and imbalance in the value sphere have a systematic organization and at the level of empirical indicators form integral factors that affect the subjective well-being. In order to verify the legitimacy of the inclusion of personal characteristics of self-efficacy, components of resilience, dispositional optimism, and problem-oriented coping strategies, we carried out a factor analysis as components of personal potential. The analysis obtained model of personal potential is shown in figure 9. Was revealed that factor loads of all these characteristics for the latent personal potential were statistically significant and reliable. This allowed us to present the latent variable for personal potential as corresponding with the appropriate indicators. Figure 10 shows the model of influence of personal potential and imbalance in the sphere of values on subjective well-being that we have built. As can be seen from the figure, we may see the influence of personal potential on subjective well-being, which indicates an increase at the level of subjective well-being with the growth of personal potential. Results obtained testify to the systematic organization of components of personal potential and the functional role of personal potential in ensuring subjective well-being. That corresponds to the concept of Leontiev, who names system organization and functionality among the characteristics of personal potential. At the same time, the imbalance in the value sphere has a significant negative impact on the level of subjective well-being. Thus, our last hypothesis that components of personal potential have a joint positive impact, the indicators of imbalance in the sphere of values, a joint negative impact on the level of subjective well-being, have been confirmed by the following statement. So during study, we made 9 conclusions shown in this slide. Can I move on? Thank you. Please move on. Thank you for your attention. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Please switch PowerPoint off. Dear members, dear council members, would you like to ask Yidan any questions at this point? Have any questions regarding the presentation? There are no questions. Then let us proceed to speeches of the Dissertation Council members and answers of the degree and the chairman's speech. Comments and negative remarks. the degree applicant may answer each reviewer in turn after each review is presented, or I suggest that you answer questions and comments after each review is presented. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah, I assume everybody's okay. No external reviews have been submitted. So let's give the floor to the council members. Since all the reviews have been published at the university website, I suggest to read or to summarize only the key points, questions, and remarks. Do council members have any objections to my suggestion? No. Let's hear the reviews. Strizhitskaya Olga Yurievna, welcome. Work I enjoyed reading. Relevance is obvious. The author developed a system of psychological predictors of subjective well-being based on Eastern culture, which is very important because many works are dedicated to subjective well-being in older age groups, but it has been demonstrated that in Eastern cultures, the idea of happiness as some general concept is very different from the Western concept. And also, possibly in different Eastern countries, this concept will be different. So the worker makes a great contribution in the understanding what is subjective well-being for the Chinese youth in general. Novelty of the work lies in the attempt to build a complete system of correlations between subjective well-being and characteristics of personal potential, and not only to correlate these results, but to correlate with values and their imbalance. Very few works have been dedicated to this in the past. The theoretical importance of the work is manifested in several aspects. First, like the author's literature overview, which, in my opinion, could be published as a separate study, gives us an opportunity to familiarize ourselves with works of Chinese researchers, authors. Works are only available in Chinese, which is also the case with Russia. So we don't have the opportunity to learn. So many thanks to Su Yidan for doing this. And I suggest that this part of the thesis should be published, not only as a thesis, which is only accessible to a small number of researchers, but maybe should be published in a number of articles or maybe a monograph. So maybe we should discuss this point. Secondly, the author creates a unique model and shows that not only interpersonal conflicts affect subjective well-being, but these impacts are interrelated. In the practical significance of the works, first of all, is in adapting the methodology to the Chinese population, Chinese psychology, and based on the description, I hope that this will become a working tool that will be used efficiently. Secondly, results obtained can be used for developing special adaptation programs for Chinese students in Russia. As the author rightly observes, a large number of students from China come to Russia every year, and not all of them manage to well adapt to the new life. Reliability of the results is ensured by relying on modern methodology, approaches, and traditions, using the correct methodological material, sufficient samples, and adequate statistical procedures. The work consists of 3 chapters, a conclusion, a list of literature, and annexes. I will not go into details here, and let me proceed to some comments. First, the second chapter doesn't describe the study sample, so the reader can only guess, was it the same sample or used to adapt the Fantalova method, or there was a different sample. Secondly, the author suggests adaptation of method as a task of a study, so it would be logical if this part was included in the empirical part. So on page 126, the author tries to interpret the conflict of values where standard deviation equals to the average. It makes the result poorly informative and difficult to interpret. So maybe you can somehow explain how you dealt with this situation. On page 128, the author writes about the clustering of the sample and three groups of students with different levels of well-being, but doesn't provide any description of student samples like origin, income, and other indicators that could have some impact on interpretation. And on page 142, a table shows that results of cluster analysis have an abnormal distribution in terms of value imbalance indicators. How has it affected the interpretation of results? Questions and comments are only comments and do not reduce the overall high appreciation of a work presented, and Yidan certainly deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of psychological sciences, in my opinion. Thank you, Olga Yurievna. Yidan, you have the opportunity to answer. Dear Olga Yurievna, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the good questions. The first question: to adapt Fantalova's methodology, data obtained. I use another sample, but they are students at the same university. As for the second question, also thank you for mentioning this. Indeed, during creation, validation of the Chinese version of Fantalova method, we received a lot of interesting data, but unfortunately, because the theme of I cannot show all this interesting data, but I completely agree that in the course of the work on adaptation of the methodology, so we, in the section that where I describe adaptation of the method, should be included in the chapter where the study results are presented. Question 3 I'd like to answer together with question 5. Fourth question, demographic indicators. Of course, the demographic factors such as origin, income, of course, have impact on the well-being. Yet, according with the thesis theme, focused on the psychological characteristics of the study participants, but in the future, I would like to focus a broader set of demographic characteristics. And question 5, answer together with question 3. Questions 3 and 5, both comments are related to data distribution. So I will answer those two questions together. Since the asymmetry values do not exceed critical values, so the asymmetry is less than 1, 3, we can assume that the distribution is close to normal. This allows us to use the parametric methods of hypothesis testing, and the standard deviation is close to the average, indicates a large data dispersion. but does not indicate that the distribution is abnormal. Thank you. Thank you. Are you satisfied? Yes, thank you. Let's proceed to a review by Anastasia Vladimirovna Miklayeva. Thank you very much. After Olga Yuryevna has such a detailed characteristic of the structure of the thesis, novelty, relevance, I will not focus. There are 2 points I'd like to mention. 2 things I would like to emphasize: how much work the author has done, looking of a literature review, methodology adaptation. Sample size, such sample size is very rare in candidates' thesis. So this gives a very good impression. Also, I think as I was reading this thesis, I had a feeling that there's lots of potential here in this work. It has much more. So it's sufficient for a thesis, but also you can see something else, something new. And while the issue upon which the author touches in her future works, she can study the structure of personal potential. First, we usually describe it as a systematic phenomenon, but how these components in the structure of personal, what is the relation between components in the structure of personal potential? I think that will be a very promising sphere for research. And that is why I got so many questions based on the material presented and some comments. So I'll start with my questions. To continue my comments on the structure, personal potential, or the balance of components of personal potential, I'd like to hear some opinion of the fact that when we see at predictors of personal potential, we see that their main contribution is made by resilience. So the role of resilience, which has been interpreted in different ways in psychology, that's a very interesting fact. So it will be interesting to learn what the author thinks about that. And also, as continuation of some already mentioned by Olga Yuryevna, I have a question: how you can relate results obtained by Yidan and the cultural specificity of concept of happiness and well-being, which in Oriental cultures, Eastern cultures, are different. Beg your pardon. You could see. Okay, here he is. Let's continue. So these are my questions, and I also have some comments, remarks. When I read the title of the thesis, psychological predictors, it says psychological predictors. So when I read about psychological predictors, I had a feeling it will include a very broad analysis. So can we stabilize camera of Dr. Krok? Yes, we can. So my first comment is about the title is too broad, broader than the thesis itself. When I look at the phrase psychological predictors, I thought the author will speak about cognitive characteristics as well as personal potential. So maybe the title is too broad. Next, a point of object of the study on page 9, the definition is found, and to me, this is a list of empirical references studied by the author, while normally the object is a fragment of reality studied by researchers. So maybe this was a new method used by the author, so it will be interesting to learn more about this. I can't agree with one idea present both in the thesis, that the data obtained can be, that we can use this data in to provide psychological support to Chinese students who come to study to Russia. I think the human behavior in new environment cannot be directly described from the data. So maybe this calls for additional tests. And finally, there are some spelling mistakes and typos, which is normal in every thesis, but in general, I think that the thesis is very interesting, has lots of potential. And on my behalf, I think that Yidan should be awarded the degree. Thank you. Thank you. Will you please answer comments by Anastasia Vladimirovna? Thank you for your answers. Let me answer your first question. Personal potential preserves stability and changing external conditions, and components of resilience have different impact at different stages of activity. For example, at the planning and goal setting phase, resilience and risk acceptance can reduce anxiety and concern, thus freeing resources for more complete perception and assessment of the situation. The phase of clarifying goals, control, inclusion are related to the willingness to act. This makes resilience an important part of personal potential. Second question, positive qualities of a person in the traditional Chinese culture include patience, endurance, and diligence. We found that the greatest contribution to the subjective well-being of our students is self-efficacy and resilience as components of the personal potential. These characteristics are in line with the requirements of the Chinese cultural tradition, and we also see that in the hierarchical structures we found that most important values for the Chinese students is the main value is the family welfare. For the Chinese students is the well-being of people who love us. This meets the requirements of caring for family members in Confucian morality. Caring for their family is not against the pursuit of personal happiness. The Confucian morality says that well-being is collective, and everyone should take care of the well-being. Our research has also shown that the level of value imbalance, although it affects reduction of subjective well-being, is not as the effect is not as strong as one might expect. In China, there's a well-known proverb which says that one should always be satisfied with the real life. Rejoice at what you have and not look at something that is not available. So I think that this proverb reflects the traditional attitude of humility and accepting lack of some benefits that the modern students have learned. This attitude protects the level of subjective well-being from the negative consequences of internal conflicts related to the lack of availability of some important values. And the first comment, I would like to thank you for your comments. Of course, I agree with your comments, and it would be better to call my thesis personal predictors of subjective well-being. And as for the second comment, yes, I also agree with this comment, and it would be more accurate to say that the components of personal potential, the imbalance in the sphere of values and subjective well-being as the object of my study. And third, comment 3, I agree that significant changes in life situation may place special demands on individual personal potential to ensure successful adaptation to the new environment. However, both the sources of conflict and coping resources we have identified for students studying in China think as subjects. So they have deep roots in the personal, especially in Chinese culture. Those traits, I think, will also be manifest themselves in new conditions. So the knowledge can be understand them is useful for a psychologist seeking to help a student. Thank you. Thank you, Sue Eden. Anastasia Vladimirovna, are you satisfied with the answers? Yes. Let us give the floor to Maria Alexeyevna Shukina and her review. Thank you. I'd like to support this thesis. I'd like to say that I found it very interesting and rejoiced at the quality of theoretical and empirical studies. And following my colleagues' speeches, Olga Yuryna, Anastasia Vladimirovna, go straight to strong points not mentioned before. I'd like to emphasize that compared with many studies of psychological well-being conducted in different countries, including China, this work is different because of comprehensive overview of the study of well-being and the desire to build a complex model that would include indicators of well-being and at the same time characteristics of the values sphere and different indicators of personal potential and personality. And this attempt to put into one model such important personal characteristics looks interesting, and the author has been successful. So I'd like to say that the text, the results, the theoretical, the empirical parts are very logical and clearly written, well structured, and the empirical results are very coherent, connected with the achievements in this sphere made by other researchers. So Sue Yidan constantly includes in the results of her study in the overall discourse, which is an advantage of her work. In the empirical part, she's done some statistical analysis, which is different, not only because of relevant choice of tools, but well-grounded multi-step analysis from statistical criteria. The author proceeds to statistical models that can be used to obtain empirically tested results and enable to explain the ideas, the connection between well-being and personal potential of an individual proposed by the author. But in such a complicated and complex work, of course, well, there is room for comments. So my comments here I will repeat what was already mentioned by my colleagues. First of my comments is that the author mentions the significance of results in working for students adapting to life in Russia. I think that maybe this expectation is not well grounded, and the empirical data mostly relate to Chinese students, to students studying in China. Maybe for Chinese students in Russia, you can see there's some potential for studying this issue. Second question is about the sample description, which is very brief, and only the age and sex are mentioned. So this balance between by gender, so where 2 times fewer boys has not been commented on. And just like Olga Yurievna, I would like the author to include this the data about field of study, maybe their financial situation, marital status, employment, maybe a part-time employment, all kinds of social and demographic characteristics which probably may have an impact on the results. And my third comment also about interesting regularities or connection between psychological well-being and sex, but it seemed to me that it has not been interpreted enough. Namely, in the work author says there's no difference between girls and boys in psychological well-being, and at the same time, there's a difference in personal potential between sexes. Many times, the author has shown the connection between well-being and personal connection, but this sex difference has not been commented on. However, these comments do not affect the overall positive impression, and I'd like to emphasize that Sue Yidan deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Psychological Sciences. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Alexeyevna. Sudan, please answer questions. Dear Maria Alexeyevna, thank you for your good and interesting questions. First question, many adaptation problems that Chinese students are facing are caused by different values and cultural habits of the two countries, while Russian scientists can understand the specific features of Chinese students. They will be able to more quickly find the reasons why Chinese students have adaptation problems, and they can better and faster help them to adapt to studying and living in Russia. Second question. So first, we considered including some social and demographic variables, but given that our topic is focused on personal characteristics and the psychological factors, so we decided not to do so. In addition, another reason is our sample is made of undergraduate and graduate students, all of whom are full-time students. So the characteristics are very similar. Almost all of them are single, and almost all of them live in hostels. But in the future, if there is a chance, it will be very interesting to take the social and demographic characteristics, such as income, full or partial parenthood, children, other children in the family, etc. As for the number of girls and boys, so this happened because most of our students or students of social, humanities, medicine, and traditionally more female students in these spheres. And in addition, the male part of the sample, only a small part of the sample returns questionnaires. Let's call it technical break. I'm afraid we have to call it technical break because Professor Krok is gone.
Okay, all right.
Let's continue. Please continue. Question 3. And while the level of subjective well-being of boys and girls is not different in the individual characteristics that ensure subjective well-being, and among the predictors of subjective well-being in the subsamples of men and women, there are both general positive and negative predictors, as well as specific ones for those subsamples. The results show that the individual characteristics have a greater influence on subjective well-being of students than gender. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are you satisfied, Maria Alexeyevna? Yes, thank you. Okay, let us give the floor to Professor Dariusz Krok, please.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone.
Uh,
For your presentation. As so many positive opinions have been expressed so far, I will succinctly concentrate just on a few points related to the thesis. As the main aim of the study undertaken by Xiu Yidan was to identify the relative contribution of the psychological factors of personal potential and the imbalance of the significance and accessibility of personal values to Chinese students' subjective well-being. The research, I think, was conducted in a very appropriate and theoretically well-grounded way. So I really enjoyed reading the thesis, as I consider it to be a very valuable and important piece of psychological work. What struck me most in a positive way was the author's ability to formulate her conclusions in relation to personality. I like her approach of connecting subjective well-being to values. As I have understood from my predecessor's words, the situation of Chinese students in Russia is quite complex from a psychological point of view, and undoubtedly, being in a foreign country, they face different adaptation problems. So Xiu Yidan's work enabled her to discover the underlying basis for subjective well-being. I'm going along with the previous positive opinions regarding the theoretical background of the thesis and its statistical analysis. Just not to remain on a basis of positive remarks, but trying to voice some academic discussion. I've got some questions. I think question 1. In chapter 1, you described the theoretical basis of your study about psychological predictors of subjective well-being of Chinese students. And you also mentioned psychological well-being. However, that's my question. for my first question. You haven't examined links, parallels, similarities, or differences between subjective and psychological well-being. You did mention the concept of psychological well-being coined by Carol Reif, but I think I didn't find any clear, quite precise differences between subjective and psychological well-being. Question 2 refers to theory of values. You mainly grounded your work on approach presented by Schwarzer, but the theory of values presented by Schwarz wasn't too highlighted. I think you haven't used too many works, articles or books written by Schwarz, and there's his 10 motivationally distinct value theories quite prominent in psychology. Question 3, I think it would be interesting if you took into account in your regression analysis the variable gender, as there were, of course, men and women in your sample. So why didn't you conduct your analysis on the basis of this variable? And also, in some parts, especially when you describe your model, statistical model, I found some causal language, and as your data was of cross-sectional design, I would be very careful with using causal language, because even even though you use structural models, if they are based on cross-sectional data, they don't allow us to draw any causal relationships. So that's my my general assessment, which is very positive, and I would like to stress many positive points of this thesis, and definitely the overall achievement meets the requirements set for a thesis for the candidate of psychological science degree. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Yidan, can you hear me? Please answer. I switched something. Can you hear me? For some reason I cannot hear you.
Вы здесь меня слышите?
Can you hear me now?
Нет.
Seems we have another. Please say something. Larissa Arsenievna, can you hear us? Let us continue. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So Yidan, please answer questions by Professor Krok. Thank you for your comments, Professor Krok. For my answer to question 1, in chapter 1, I briefly described concept of well-being in terms of philosophical concept of hedonism and eudaimonism. But from the point of view, I agree it would be better if I made some conclusion in the end to make it more prominent, make the differences more obvious and easier to understand. And the answer to the second question, of course, Schwartz's contribution in the field of values, and his theory and methods are now widely recognized around the world. And I used Schwartz values questionnaire adapted for Chinese sample. I used in my master's thesis, but in this thesis, I used Fantalova's method, which is based on the scale created on the basis of the list of terminal values made by Rockich. And that is why a concept by Rockich was given more attention in the text of the thesis. But thank you very much for the idea. So I'll think about using the list of 10 motivational values by Schwartz to measure the level of values imbalance. And I think that will be very interesting. And now let me answer your third question. Your comment is absolutely correct. In my thesis, I used the differences between men and women. Their results showed that there is no difference in all indicators of subjective well-being. However, including sex as an independent variable in regression analysis would make it possible to determine to what extent sex can serve as a predictor of subjective well-being. And the results would allow for a deeper analysis than a study that simply compares men's and women's indicators. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krok. Now, as the chairman, let me present my review. I was also very impressed by Sue Yidan's thesis, and let me say that her the strong points of her thesis are: first, is that in modern psychology, the issue of subjective well-being and psychological health gets lots of attention, but there are no only the social and demographic and even cultural aspects have been studied, and many works are dedicated to that. But as for the personal aspects and personal factors which may impact well-being, a lot remains unclear. And Yidan set herself the task to answer these questions. Also, an advantage of her work is that the complex and coherent view of personal resources that affect personal well-being and properties, personalities and strategies, and personal conflicts. So I've never came across works which considered these parameters together. An advantage of this work is the close analysis of sex issues, of maintaining subjective well-being. This is also fairly rare. And speaking of results of this thesis, I'd like to focus on some results obtained by the author. First, indeed, the author identified personal resources. So it's a complex of resources, which set of resources which help a person to maintain his personal well-being. the author identified the key resources such as self-efficacy and resilience. The author demonstrated the role of strategies pursued by men and women. For men, the main strategy is to preserve well-being is asking for getting social support, which helps to maintain a psychological well-being. I was also attracted by the data about the differences of impact of structure of interpersonal conflicts and how they are in their relation to subjective well-being obtained in men and women. And Yidan identified an interesting fact that for subjective well-being of men, it's important to have internal vacuum, which no absence of the internal vacuum, which means that men, for subjective well-being, need to have strong motivation, motivation for action, and absence of such motivation creates inner vacuum in the sphere of values, which means you will everything and you stop wanting things. So this factor of subjective has a negative impact on men, while in women, indeed, interpersonal conflict, this factor affects may reduce personal well-being when there's a big difference between values significant for a woman and values available which are accessible to her. This fact, I think, has been identified for the first time, and I think it has a significant. It's significant for understanding the sources of conflict, different sources of conflict in men and women, and to provide quality psychological support to different sexes. So these results were obtained for a Chinese population, but studies conducted by us on Russian teenage population, we obtained very similar results. For men, it's important to have motivation, and for women, it's important to have accessible values. So, which shows maybe that this sphere is somewhat universal and free from cultural impact. Was also shown by, and the regularities shown by Yidan can have universal value, and not only meaningful, not only for the Chinese population. I think it's also very interesting the hierarchy of impacts on subjective well-being, the hierarchy of different resources, which shows that the greatest impact is made by personal qualities such as resilience, efficacy, and the personal conflicts are regulated, can be regulated by the person himself, which indicates the direction for future research, which maybe will be conducted by, say, practical psychologists. I think in general, the results of the thesis by Yidan make a contribution to understanding resources of man to maintain psychological health. They have significance for personality psychology and maybe can be used in development psychology, because she's talking about a particular, the author is talking about a particular age group. So let me share. So I also share the same positive opinion already expressed by my colleagues and other council members. And if speaking of practical application, of course, there are 2 points here. First, adaptation of the diagnostics method, which was made available to Chinese psychologists, and can be used in comparative studies to compare Chinese and Russian samples. And speaking of the possibility to use these results for psychological support, these data, first of all, they is significant for the Chinese students studying in China, but they can also be taken into account by us, of course, working with Chinese students in Russia to study. And speaking of comments, I have 2 main suggestions to the author. The first suggestion is relates to the fact, which has already been mentioned, that the analysis of data on subjective well-being in men and women shows there are no differences between samples. And the author explains this, that in modern China, the men and women are absolutely equal. But the data that we have in Russia also show that by subjective well-being, there are no significant differences between men and women. And in addition to that, to interpret this fact, Yidan uses existential factors, that the social factors, saying that social factors for equality have been created. But in her hypothesis and in literature overview, the author says, and that's initiated this study, is psychological, not individual factors. So that is why such, I think this contradiction should be eliminated in the future. And next, my second idea is the comparative analysis of between Russian sample is two Chinese students have significantly lower value of money ratio value ratio conflict than in Russian students. In Russian students, this conflict is more expressed. Unfortunately, there is no explanation. So it will be interesting to know, do Chinese students set themselves more realistic goals, or they have more opportunities to satisfy their needs than the Russian students. So these are, so it will be interesting to hear Yidan's explanation. But I think otherwise the thesis meets all the requirements. The thesis and Sui Yidan on the basis deserves to be awarded the academic degree of candidate of psychological sciences, specialty 190001, general psychology. That's all I had to say. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to give the floor to Sui Yidan and let her answer my comments. Thank you, Larissa Arsenievna. I would like to answer your first comment. I think I have already mentioned to other reviewer. Your second question this gap, I think, is partly due to the characteristics of our sample. Their social and demographic situation is very similar, and also all these our students in our sample, they are students at prestigious universities, so they have this makes them more positive and sure of themselves, and self-efficacy in our sample is higher, and that means that they are more sure of themselves and they know their capabilities better, and they will set more realistic goals, set themselves more realistic goals, compare. And the other reason, as I have already said, is a traditional Chinese culture which encourages people to be satisfied with what you already have. And maybe this tradition also has an impact on how how the modern students see life. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. So we in our chat is so no questions have been received by email. That is why I suggest we give the floor to the academic advisor of the degree applicant, Olga Ivanovna Danilenko. Olga Ivanovna, please turn the sound on and tell us about the degree applicant and her work. Do you support all the provisions of the thesis, and which provisions, in your opinion, are deserve special attention? Thank you. I support all the provisions put out for defense, but special achievement is that she adapted a method created in Russia to Chinese population, so balance in the value sphere. She found and analyzed differences and characteristics of subjective well-being, identified positive and negative predictors, emotional and cognitive components, general and specific for men and women, and finally, component of personal potential is an integral factor which impact subjective well-being. While writing her thesis, the student displayed innovation, was focused. She overcame the difficulties. She was managed to present an impressive sample. She passed all the exams, took active part in her studies, took part in conferences, made presentations. She published 6 articles, including articles in peer-reviewed journals. During the time of her studies, Yidan mastered Russian. She speaks and writes Russian well. She's nice, can establish and maintain good contact. I'm her academic advisor since her 2nd year. And over that period, she was a very hard-working student. And now she became a very well-trained young researcher. So I'd like to wish her in her home country to use the great potential that she accumulated while studying in Russia. Thank you. Thank you, Olga Ivanovna. Dear colleagues, since we are all working in the remote access mode, I'd like to ask, do council members and others present, as well as the degree applicant herself, any questions which have not been answered yet? or maybe answer questions, so anything related to working in remote access mode. So if you have, no, we don't have any questions. Thank you. Then I have another question for the Dissertation Council members. Now we have the opportunity before voting. We may take a break to discuss the results. The sound will be switched off. What do you think? Do we need such a break to discuss the thesis, or you are all ready to give your opinions without this private discussion?
We are. I don't have any questions.
Вопросов нет. Since while our opinions were very similar, I think we don't need any private discussion and may proceed straight to voting. I will ask all the council members for their opinions. Each council member has to give his or her opinion independently. So do you think that Sue Yidan deserves awarding the academic degree of candidate of psychological sciences, specialty 190001? May I start asking the council members? Olga Yurievna Strizhitskaya, your opinion, please. I support the work, I think, and I vote for. Anastasia Vladimirovna, I fully support the work and I vote for. Maria Alexeyevna, dear Larissa Arsenievna, dear colleagues, I support the work and I vote for. Thank you. Dear Professor Krok.
I'm very positive about the work, so I'm...
Да, мне... And me, I also support. Could you please say again? Could you please say again what you think? Dr. Krok, are you for?
Yes,
are you
yes,
for
I'm fully supporting the positive decision.
Here, thus, 5 members of the Dissertation Council are present and all 5 voted for awarding the academic degree, and so we may say that so let me announce, dear colleagues, that out of 5 members of the Dissertation Council members participating, 5 voted for, no one voted against, and no one abstained. So the decision to award to Sue Yidan the degree of candidate of psychological sciences in scientific specialty 190001, general psychology, personality psychology, and history psychology, has been made. So the decision has been made by all, been supported by all the council members. Thank you. Dear colleagues, since our meeting was held in the remote access mode, do the Dissertation Council members or the degree applicant or others present have any questions concerning the procedure of the session? No, we don't have any comments. No comments. Then let us give the floor to the degree applicant for her closing remarks. Thank you. First of all, I would like to give big thanks for my defense Thank you for reading my work so carefully and for asking me such interesting, good questions. I would like to give big thanks to the university faculty where I wrote this thesis, and my biggest thanks go to my wonderful academic advisor, Danilenko Olga Ivanovna. Thank you for always being close to me when I had problems with adaptation, and for the support for support she gave me with my work. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yidan, dear council members, let me, on your behalf, to congratulate Yidan on being awarded the academic degree. We congratulate you. We wish you lots of success in the future in your research. We hope to see new works written by you. Thank you very much, and congratulations. Dear colleagues, I thank all the council members present who worked hard to prepare for this session, and who took part, gave their opinions. Thank you, everybody. Many thanks, everybody. I declare the session closed. I declare the session closed.
Okay.
So if we have no questions, you wanted to say something, Dariush? No.
No, I'm just saying thank you.
If we have no comments from the technical, from the support department, then I declare the session closed. Please stop online broadcasting.